to introduce Robert Fay, who, by the way, is my boss at the Center for International Governance Innovation, which is a think tank in Canada. And he can tell you a little bit more about it. So, Dr. Fay, take it away.
Yeah, that was very formal. I don't normally go by Robert unless I'm in trouble. So, and yes, I work for the Center for International Governance Innovation, which is a research institute or think tank based in Canada. And we do work on governance of digital technologies. So Susan and I have collaborated for many years now, and it's truly a pleasure to work with Susan. I've learned a lot from her, and I want to congratulate her on this conference because Susan is always forward-looking, and I think this conference exemplifies that. So thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, so our panel, I mean, is you got the name right behind us. So why don't we just move right in? And I'm going to start with the first question and then ask the panelists just to briefly introduce themselves. So, so the first question is, how can we make data governance an issue of civics? And so the way I frame this is in my country, Canada, there's a big focus right now on financial literacy, probably because our household indebtedness is extremely high. So the government has decided anyway, I'm going to the intricacies of the Canadian education system. There's a focus on financial literacy, but there is no focus on data literacy in the education system. And I think one could argue that there should be. The question is, how would you do it? Like we've heard over the last couple of days, this is a complicated area and it requires a lot of expertise, lots of different voices. So we're going to probe some of this. So why don't we start with that first question, and I'm going to turn right here to Reema. And
thank you. So hi everyone, my name is Reema Patel. I'm head of deliberative engagement at an organisation called Ipsos. I live in Cambridge in the UK. I'm also involved in a UK-based initiative called the ESRC Digital Good Network. ESRC is a social science research council based in the UK and supports the academic research ecosystem in the UK. You want me to answer this question or just introduce myself?
No, why don't you take a stab at it and we'll, whatever you'd like to say.
I'll have a go at this. So there's two things. One is around data governance and the other is about the idea of the civic. So how do I think about the civics is a really interesting concept. One of the ways I think about the civics is what a civics is not. And the frame that comes to my mind is this idea of enclosure models of data. So the idea literally that you fence around data and you say this is a property-based notion and it belongs to insert name. And in terms of thinking about civics, that's taking a different approach to data. Thinking about data as something that we all collectively govern, share, have a stake in. And in recent work, I've thought increasingly of notions such as stewardship. I think some people spoke earlier in the conference about fiduciary notions of governance, so recognizing the relationship people have through data to each other. I think these are all ways of thinking about the civic. So how do we make data governance an issue of the civic? One is to think about data itself as part of the civics. So and that requires conceptualizing how we think about data and moving beyond these property-based notions towards a rethink of data. So some of the work that we did when I was at the Lovelace Institute was about rethinking data so that we thought about data as itself collectively governed and shared. And then an extension of that has been, okay, so if we start from that standpoint and that framing, what does that mean in terms of how we think about the technologies that emerge from that data? And of course, this conference is very much about that. So the challenge I would like to pose to some of the earlier speakers, in particular the speaker from Microsoft, is how do we move beyond the idea that the technologies that emerge from the data and the data is just enclosed within the corridors of Microsoft power, to recognizing that these textbooks came from a lot of people's very important work. The synthetic data then comes from their really important work, even if it's not, you know, the textbooks themselves. And then the technology is also then derived from that. And I'm not sure we're there yet. So that's like the opening down there, but I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Yeah, I understand he's left. He's not here today, so I think a few people had questions for him. But let's turn to Michael Runningwolf, please.
Hello, I am a machine learner and machine learner researcher at the Mila First Languages AI Reality Initiative, and which is in Montreal, Quebec, which is a research lab founded by Joshua Bengio and funded, through a combination of provincial and federal grants. But I'm doing international research. I myself am a Native American, so a little bit of terminology. In Canada, it's First Nations. In the United States, it's Native American. And the context in which I'm working with in terms of civics is, in our data is that you have tribal communities who have a history of dealing with colonization. And internally, each tribe has, it's a heterogeneous field, and tribes have their own mechanisms of data and how data is being shared internally and externally. And we're conducting automatic speech recognition research that crosses the border because my tribe, the Cheyenne, Lakota, and Blackfeet, we were both sides of the continent. We were in Alberta, Canada, and we're in the United States, Montana, all the way down to Mexico. So our communities cross the borders, and the border is a synthetic construct to us. And so now we come to reality, and how do we deal with data governance in the face of the United States? Native Americans are federally recognized tribal entities, and that can be in the form of tribal reservations, tribal fairly recognition, state recognition, like there are tribes that are only recognized by the state. And then you have corporations like in Alaska. And similarly in Canada, I'm not so well versed, but there is also that complex, they have the reserve system and their relationship to the crown, and also the relationship to the provinces. And so we're talking about collecting data, managing data, and having to deal with the framework of this huge boggle, essentially. And at the end of the day, the objective of the research is language reclamation. Communities across North America are facing extinction of their languages. In the United States alone, we have about 500 language communities. 90% of them are endangered, and more so critically endangered. Within the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see an acceleration of languages. And UNESCO tracks Indigenous languages, and there are about 7,000 languages in the world, and 50% of them are endangered. And we lose a language every 14 days in the world. 60% of them are happening here in the United States, primarily in the Southwest, where we have a large language diversity in Oklahoma, Texas, surrounding area. And we need technology to start swinging the pendulum the other way. And that's what the eventual goal of the automatic speech recognition, but doing it in a way that's also ethical and abides by the community needs. And so like, as an AI researcher, we are making sure that the community defines our objectives, but also the community also defines what are we doing with the data. And so now, having given you this whole overview of this big old tangle of hair and different domains and registrations, I'm really curious if you guys have ever dealt with something analogous, obviously, because the traditional model doesn't necessarily work. There's been a lot of exploitation of Indigenous data, and Indigenous communities across the world, I was just talking to someone from Brazil, are fully cognizant of data exploitation and would rather not participate in large data projects, which is a healthy response, but it also limits our ability to develop advanced technology. So we need a balance, a safe balance. Thank you. That was a bit of a long answer.
That's a word that's come up, I think, over the course of 2 days, the balance, and how to find that balance and who determines the balance. Anyway, you've already met Jeni, so why don't we just let Jeni launch in?
Okay, so I think that the question that we're talking about is around kind of what level do we need the public to be at in order to sensibly engage in this debate, right? That's what I think the question is about. So I have two kinds of contributions on this. One is about recognizing the difference between being able to handle data yourself, right? Be able to do data science or create AI, and the ability to criticize it and understand it and to be able to engage critically with it. I have a post that I wrote a while ago now, comparing data literacy to English literacy, and talking about how we in a school system both educate people around English language and give them the ability to write poems and novels and essays and those kinds of things, but also teach English literature. So that's like critical engagement with the way in which with poems and with plays and with novels and so forth, in, unpicking where they come from, who are the authors, what are the contextual kind of cultures that generate them, and those kinds of things. And I think we need a similar kind of distinction in the way in which we think about data literacy. There's the hands-on type of part of data literacy, and then there's the, I think, much more important critical engagement, understanding the context of data, of the way in which data is used. So, the way in which censuses were used in order to strip power from people and support enclosure and those kinds of things. The other, so it's like data as a language, data as literature. The other thing that I think it comes out with the civics is understanding our data rights, right? Understanding where we can, what our rights are in the world, what we can act on. And there, I think that we have a lot more of there's a lot more need for support from civil society organizations who can fight for our rights for us, so that we don't have to be always exercising them individually ourselves, but that we can have people who are who have the capacity and the knowledge and expertise in order to do that for us and on our behalf, and enabling that to happen in a way that isn't that still represents the diversity of public is, I think, a real challenge. But the other thing that I really want to tackle with this is that I often find people talk about the need for the public to be more educated as an excuse for not engaging with them, right? It's like, we can't listen to you because you don't really know what you're talking about. And that is fundamentally problematic. Just because you don't have deep technical understanding of the way in which data and AI works does not mean that you can't have an opinion on the way in which it's going to impact your life. And in all of the kinds of engagements that we've studied, looked at, and also done ourselves for the public, an important part of how you engage the public is how you bring them up to speed with, in a fair way and in a balanced way, bring them up to speed with what those issues are. It should always be part of that engagement and deliberation strategy about bringing, like, meeting the public where it's at, not imagining that they can only participate if they meet some kind of checklist about their education level or So while I think that education piece and how we gradually build in, understanding of critical approaches to data and AI and understanding of our rights is really important, I don't think it should be the barrier to public engagement.
Yeah, so that leads into the next set of questions, and it came up yesterday in an interesting way. And we often, and I know I say this often, we need a multi-stakeholder approach to governance, a multi-stakeholder, inclusive, representative approach. What does that actually mean? And yesterday, I hate to talk about the person from Microsoft since he's not here, but anyway, it was very interesting when he was asked a question about, how do you bring in different perspectives? And he said, well, the people working on model development are coming from a whole bunch of different countries. And the way the model is evaluated and making sure we're doing the right thing is separate from the division I work in. It's a different division. And they oversee it. And then my assumption would be when they're overseeing that work, they're probably using certain types of codes of conduct that the tech industry has developed. So in fact, you actually haven't got a multi-stakeholder approach. You've got a particular perspective that's brought into that development process. So how do we go beyond that? Like, how do you actually operationalize multi-stakeholder and go beyond the words? And who would like to start that discussion?
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Good job.
So, I mean, a lot of my work has focused on participatory approaches, but increasingly I think of what we do and what I do as not bringing the whole system together in a room to deliberate about a particularly complex and contentious issue. So I spent a lot of time running citizen juries and citizen councils and other participatory public dialogues, not just on data and AI, but on other challenging topics and things like, you know, genomics to net zero pathways for the UK government. So that's the range of work and fields I've worked in. And in terms of data and AI in general, I think that it doesn't hurt to think about the data life cycle. And I think Jeni summarized it really nicely, you know, all the way from defining use purpose, collection, storage, analysis, through to application. And now we've got probably another cycle around the uses of generative AI and other technologies emerge from it. So it's quite interesting. You can almost think of different steps at which you can engage different stakeholders.
Yeah, like I think.
So
The
the
Jeni, the
most
ecosystem,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
Just to say, the first stage is like the purpose and the use, and then the last stage is around evaluation and did it have the impact and what impact did it have. So they're different steps, but I think the beginning and the end are probably the most important in terms of bringing different stakeholders in to deliberate.
So I guess the question is, how do you bring those stakeholders in? So you talked to a couple of different models. Jeni, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I think when I introduced myself earlier, then I talked about one of the gaps that I see in the landscape around data governance, and when we talk about bringing diverse voices into these conversations, there is a underdeveloped piece that is about the practice of what that looks like when given that the kinds of decisions that we need to make around data and AI are operate at different kinds of levels. So you have, you know, places where you're having high-level policy conversations internationally about AI safety. You have all the way down to, you know, a specific HR system within a workplace, right? That there's varying different types of conversations that we might be wanting to have. And we also have varying kinds of capacity within organizations to bring in different kinds of voices, varying types of communities and diversity of communities that need to be brought into those decision-making processes, and variance in the kind of legibility of those communities. So, you know, in a workplace setting, then you may or may not have a unionized kind of workforce that you can actually engage with. So there is a big space of different kinds of decisions that need to be made with different and diverse sets of people that need to have different kinds of participation approaches applied to them. One of the pieces of work that we've been doing at Connected by Data is, because I love games, producing a game around creating governance stacks, right? That really highlights that we've got lots and lots of different tools in our toolbox, right? We can use citizen juries, we can use surveys, we can use focus groups, we can have people on governance boards, et cetera, and we can use all of those kinds of techniques and should use all of those kinds of techniques so that we can bring in different voices in different kinds of situations as are needed. So I think that the the kind of sorry, my jet lag is really hitting at the moment. So I think I think that the thing that we really need to do is actually to help educate the people who are who are organizing these governance systems, that there are this huge plethora of different types of techniques that they can use and how to use them well. And like one other thing that I would say is that we need to think carefully about where the role of civil society organizations in representing publics and their ability to also represent those publics. I don't think that civil society is necessarily in fact, I'll go further than that. I think civil society is a useful, extremely crucial tool as part of how these multi-stakeholder conversations need to happen. It helps if they also have some public, like direct public engagement in order to support those conversations too. And we can talk about, I can talk about example for the AI Safety Summit stuff if that would be helpful. But maybe.
Well, why don't we go to Michael next, because you represent a community that actually, or you're from a community that actually isn't part of a lot of these discussions that are taking place on data governance, and so you're forging your own path and I guess trying to figure out what works for, I'll use the word Indigenous communities.
Yeah, I think it's relevant to say that Indigenous communities in North America, cross border, majority of us don't have internet. Majority of us don't have access to reliable water or electricity. I grew up without water. Like, we technically had a faucet, but it was more often than not dry. The light switch didn't really work, and I didn't get the telephone, wire telephone, until I was like 15 years old. And that basically, and naturally, I became a computer scientist. Go figure. But so we just have basic issues of access. And so when we're talking about engaging with stakeholders, our stakeholders who are communities participating in my AI research, we had to go to them. We had to go to Nia Bay, which is on the most furthest western tip of the lower 48. And it's on the Pacific Ocean. And anytime it rains or anytime it's windy, they lose electricity and the internet. And so the Zoom call goes away. And if you've ever been to the Pacific coast, it's actually quite windy and quite rainy. We're like 2 or 3 hours as fly as the crow flies from Seattle. And so Seattle is famously dry. And so we just have basic, and let's get past that. So we have fundamental access problems. And we're not at a level field as we would with other communities, mainstream urban communities in the United States. And this isn't a problem that's just centered on the communities I work with. This is all across Canada, all across the United States. If you drive 2 hours outside of Seattle, you no longer have cell phone, you no longer have internet, you no longer have water. Similarly, in British Columbia, you can drive 2 hours away from Calgary, and suddenly you might starve to death if you run out of gas. And so when we're engaging these communities, it does take face time. Communities don't, a lot of these have traditional mechanisms of introducing themselves, being able to outreach them is the practical limit. And the other one is their own internal data governance. And so, which is more cogent to this, is that how do we create a policy of data protections and security such that the participating communities feel comfortable sharing their identifying data, so that the kind of data we're collecting for natural language processing isn't tweets, isn't something off Instagram, isn't a blog post. These are sacred stories, or stories that the communities hold sacred, voices of community members that have passed on. And many tribes and communities are very sensitive about, if there's a voice of their grandparents who are ancestors who have passed on, there's taboos around even listening to it. And so we need to have a strategy where we're respecting their desires on a technical level. So what does that mean? Like, so we're working with a community that has a story, and it's this rich, very long, interesting story. Has a lot of data, and it's annotated. They typed it up. That's just like the mother's milk for AI. But they said, you're not allowed to not recite the story end to end. You have to make sure that the story has to be completed. And so how do we address that? Even if we're just servicing, a taboo at a technical level, what is the practical implementation detail? Do we remove it from the training data set and only use that for, the test data set? Because we don't want to unintentionally break their confidence in us, and making sure that we're doing this in a respectful, spiritual way that they feel comfortable conducting the research. So even though I myself am Indigenous, I'm an external outsider to these people. I'm like slightly friendlier than a Westerner, but I'm still an outsider because I'm from Montana. And so some of the things we have to work with is start to raise the bar for research. And so one interesting thing about Indigenous communities is despite not having access, we are very aware of data colonization. Like there was the Declaration of Balim in the 1980s around pharmaceuticals going into the rainforest and extracting and exploiting, interesting drugs. There's a famous Sean Connery movie, The Medicine Man. If you really look at it from an Indigenous lens, he probably shouldn't have been out there. He should have asked more permissions. But and so we are aware, cognizant of data colonization. What we're missing though is awareness of what the technology can do, because it's not something we're grown with. I mean, we're not growing up in the digital space, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's, running all through what you've just said is trust. Like, how does one build trust in that what you provide, you may do it voluntarily or it may be done through consent that you don't fully understand. That information is going to be used in a trusted way that respects the values of your community. And, it leads to the next question that, that we do have these large data sets that are being used to train these algorithms. But like the way the question is raised, developing countries are underrepresented. We know that. But of course, different communities are also underrepresented, or, depending on how one wants to think about this. But so how does one incentivize the participation of different communities so that we get data sets upon which, the algorithms can be trained to lead to outcomes or lead to I don't know, let's say model outcomes that we think are representative. Maybe I didn't quite say that right, but who would like to take that?
Maybe just to end cap what I was saying earlier, and I'll be super quick. I'm sorry. Yeah, I think you guys.
You have lots of time.
Oh yeah, I think we can't think of it as a two-dimensional policy problem or even a three-dimensional policy problem of, the governance people and, laws. And the dimension that we're approaching this is we're approaching this from a holistic perspective, in that we're servicing the community desires. We have partners. There are research partners. They're not our research subjects. They define our technical objectives. I'm a former Amazonian. One of our leadership principles when I was at Amazon was customer obsession, earn trust, bias racks, but there's a whole like 15 of them. And so first and foremost, we're collecting from these communities, and our research objectives are derived from what they want. And number two, to address the overall holistic problem of they don't participate in technology. And so we need to overcome those barriers. Like we get grants, like we had a industry grant from Meta AI provided us laptops. And so we go into the communities, and one of the initiatives I'm working on is teaching AI. We teach kids, Lakota kids in South Dakota who don't have internet. In the United States, only 20% of all Native Americans have access to internet and a computer. Most of us experience the internet through our cell phones, and only 40% of us had that. And so we can't eat the whole buffalo all at once. We can't lay fiber to every community. But what we can do is buy some Dell laptops and fly them to a community and teach them what AI is and address the problem at its core. They're non-practitioners. They don't have a relationship to big data and AI. And so we'll teach them so that we have peers. We're creating communities that will then become peers on this research, and we're addressing it from a different dimension as well. Like we're addressing the needs of the community and trying to elevate them so that they can be knowledgeable participants and start defining their own history. Like, why should I, a Montana boy, own the data of someone from Washington or British Columbia? Why don't they own the infrastructure? Why don't they define what data governance is for them? And I'm just their ally and on their path. And I think that's important for these communities that don't fundamentally have access. We can't just have policy and rules that say we'll be nice to them. We need to actually make them creators and give them the means of production as well.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying is a good reminder that the digital divide is there, and it's actually in areas that we think it probably isn't. We just assume everyone's got the infrastructure when in fact it's not the case, and it's definitely not the case in Canada too. Jeni, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, so there's been a really interesting paper recently talking about, and I can't remember the authors of it, talking about the participatory turn in AI. And it looks at that particular phrase was the one, so you should be able to look it up and find it, participatory turn. And it analysed the way in which participation was used in academic articles around the development of AI systems against a framework that looked at what participation actually looked like, right? So if you look at the general frameworks around participation levels, that goes from being informed about something that is happening, that's going to happen to you, through to like actual ownership and control over what that looks like, right? So there's being informed, being consulted, being like co-generating, and then like, there's ones that Reema developed at the Ada Lovelace Institute, and there are others in other different kinds of places. And what this participatory turn paper looked at was classifying a bunch of papers against that kind of framework with different kinds of aspects of the things that were presented. So, for example, to what extent did the community get to determine what the participation looked like in the first place, for example, or how the questions were set? And the results of that paper were that the vast majority of the ways in which that participation was framed was actually just like informing or maybe consulting a little bit on what the user interface for a particular AI system looked like. It was nothing like the kind of ownership over that you were talking about, Michael, about setting what the targets are. You know, so Bob, your question, like, how do we get more of this kind of data into these systems in order to address bias? Well, shouldn't we actually be asking what is it that the communities who are involved actually want out of these systems? What are their concerns about the way in which it might be misused? Or, like, there are very reasonable concerns for people not wanting to have, for communities not wanting to be represented in data sets, right? And as well as advantages for why they should be. But if all we're doing is trying to like win their trust to get more out of them, we're fundamentally missing what we should be doing, which is giving the people who are affected by data and AI control over what gets collected, all of those different stages in the life cycle. So I think this is a really important like part of the way in which we think about participation. It's not just a nice to have that helps us to win trust and all of those kinds of things. It is fundamentally a giving of power to other people, and that's the challenge with it, right? That like realizing that is the challenge with it. But that's what we need to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think you reinforced Michael's points very, very well. Reema, did you have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, and to build on those points, which I agree with, there's something about how we are framing the questions around participation. And broadly speaking, I think there's two ways to do this. One is to say, we're building this thing now, engage with us on this thing that we've chosen to build. Another way is to say, how can we be helpful and build something that you think is going to be useful and valuable? And they're two totally different, I mean, they're both participation, but they're participation for totally different purposes. And I would argue the second approach is much more about how can the AI system be useful to society? Whereas the first approach is a bit more, we think we kind of already know how we're being useful to society, and we kind of need you, wider stakeholder groups, to sense check that. And I mean, you know, in lots of contexts, power is constrained, and we are in an asymmetrical power environment. So we see both types of participation. But I think the ideal is more of a second type. And I would go as far as to say as we don't see much of that when it comes to the governance of our data system. But that's the ideal and that's the vision we should be aspiring for.
The one thing that we haven't talked a lot about at this conference is international rules of the game. I'm not sure if our panel wants to weigh in on this, but it is, I mean, we know nationally we're struggling with this issue. So how do we get international rules, for example, that will respect what local communities want? Like, how do we bridge that gap? And it's a big one. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
So, as I think I said earlier, I think that the kinds of decisions that get made around data and AI happen at multiple different levels. So there's the international kinds of conversations, there's the national kind of conversations that they ripple down into particular sectors, they ripple down into particular like local communities or into workplaces or into schools and so on. So from my perspective, I think we need a lot more of the context-specific, contextualized governance conversations at that lower level. So in the workplace, in a local community, and so on. And the big job of the higher levels, I think two big jobs of the higher levels. One big job of the high level is to encourage, and sometimes enforce those conversations to happen, right? So it's to create a framework whereby organizations which are engaging, introducing an AI system into a particular local area have to have a consultation with the population within that local area, or organizations that are introducing it into a workplace have to have a conversation with their workforce before it even gets introduced into the system. So there's a bit of getting the agreement at those higher kinds of levels about what enables us to have those lower level conversations that I think is really essential. And then the other thing that I think is important at those higher levels is to have the difficult global conversations about what future we want. What role do we want to have AI playing in our lives? What's the society that we're building towards, which are largely political kinds of conversations to have. And those political conversations need to have everybody engaged in them and active and as part of them. So yeah, those are the ways in which I'm seeing there's a thing about convening at those international and national levels, the general frameworks and things like that, but what it enables at the lower levels is the thing that I think is really crucial.
Yeah, I can tell you that doesn't come up too often, I think, in the conversations that I'm part of. But it's really is an important point. Do you want to, you have any points you want to raise, Michael and Reema?
Yeah, just real quickly. It's not for the Indigenous context, there actually is a little bit of thought around what we need. The WTO actually has some interesting insights, the World Trade Organization insights on how Indigenous data, intellectual property should be treated. Because one thing that affects us is that communal data, Indigenous data, songs, cultural artifacts are considered public domain. And this limits our ability to protect them using the copyright system. And, obviously there's arguments plus or for using that system. Another body of work is also by the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and they also have some policy recommendations. And of course, I have some concerns about the UN just in general, but it's always the lowest bar, I feel sometimes. No offense for the United Nations nerds in the room, but I think it's a good start. I think there's some very specific policy objectives that Indigenous peoples want, and we participated in this work. And of course, it's non-binding. But I think it would behooves you, if you're interested in this work of what Indigenous peoples want. We actually have some very specific objectives that are laid out by the WTO and the UNDRIP documents.
So I was really interested, still in this international rules question. And one question I've got is, what about the ones we already have and they're used and their application. The other is about some of the public attitudes work that I've looked at over the years in different countries, and the realization that there are very different cultural norms and expectations. So I'm struggling to balance the two things, really. It's a tricky one because you want scope for I kind of the EU is really interesting in this respect because it's got laws that apply across the European Union, but then there's scope for member states to interpret those laws differently. And so I'm wondering whether that's something we need to learn from, number one. The other thing is, what new rules would we want to add? Or are there existing rules that could be applied in this specific context? So there's a few questions I have there. And I have to say, I'm not convinced that we're very close to a shared set of international rules because of the phenomenon of what I would describe as AI nationalism. So the extent to which this has become a domain in which the geopolitics of different countries is playing out. And we see this really evidently in the discussions around the EU AI Act and regulation generally. So yeah, I want to believe it's possible, but my question is, how feasible is it? Or are there existing frameworks that it might be more realistic to work from, where we already have international collaboration in place? So it's an open question for the room.
Yeah, I mean, I would point to some work that Susan did many years ago with Patrick LeBlanc on data realms. It's just as relevant today as it was in 2018, I think, when you wrote the paper. I thought maybe now we'd open up the floor to questions. So, okay, well, you're the first person I see, so, and then we'll go over here. So microphone, please. Yeah, just so we can, people on the line.
I wanted to build on your question and ask a ruder version of it. First, I want to remind people this is Chatham House rule, so anything you say stays in the room, even though we're broadcasting. I'm a professional meeting attender, travel around the world and organize and participate. Just got back from Delhi, 17 hours. Help me figure out where not to waste my time. Which organizations trying to grapple with the international issues of data governance are a waste of time? And which ones do you think are really doing constructive work? You get one answer.
Sorry, I have to start by saying my organization is focused on the international governance. So I'm going to put a plug in, shamelessly put a plug in for CIGI. Yeah.
I mean, I think they're all doing important work. It's just a question of, who's got the mandate from literally every citizen in the world. That's what we're talking about. And that's a really tough ask. So if I had to say one institution I think that's been very thoughtful, I do think the European Union, the discussions around the AI Act, they've been really interesting. So I've been following that for many years. And I think that what has emerged in the AI Act is a really interesting risk-based approach based on a very historic framework of product safety. So I think it's interesting. People may disagree with the content of it, but it's definitely interesting and it's definitely leading work.
I would say the Canadians are doing some interesting work. Even though I'm not Canadian, I keep getting roped in on all these discussions on the AI governance bill or whatever. You guys are parliament. I don't know what they're called. But yeah, I think the Canadians have been particularly progressive in soliciting Indigenous viewpoints and minority viewpoints, which I've not seen replicated in anywhere else, or specifically the States.
Well, that's very encouraging to hear. Jeni?
This is a difficult question to answer. I think one thing that I will observe is that many of the organizations that are trying to set rules you know, whether you're looking at kind of G7, OECD, you're looking at, you know, the people that attended the AI Safety Summit in the UK, et cetera, exclude a huge portion of the world and an important portion of the world. And I think that I would be trying to find the places where there was more inclusion of the global majority in that decision making, rather than just focusing on people who are already educating things.
Okay, so
Do you have an answer besides CIGI and Susan's organization? Is there another one I should pay attention to? I might not be.
well, I guess we shouldn't leave Carnegie out, should we? Why do I think it's Alex? Yeah.
And then there's someone.
And then there's someone in the back and then over here.
Hi, no, this is a really great conversation. So, let me think how to frame this, because there's a conversation. I'm keyed into two things that were discussed. One was on multi-stakeholder engagement, which to me,
Turn it on. Okay, just speak loud.
testing.
But I want, okay.
Just come to the podium.
This one.
Which one? Oh.
At the lectern. So I know I earned that, doctor. So there's a lot of discussion around multi-stakeholder engagement, and then I think also in the different registers of participation, which Jeni referred to. And so I think I'm almost thinking that some of the questions around shared data governance are maybe downstream of what I like to call problem formulation, or that's kind of what's the term used in by folks like Samir Bassi and Salam Baragos. And so what I'm thinking a little bit about is like, what are different frameworks that you could suggest in sort of thinking not only in talking about data governance, but about problem formulation in AI, and thinking of what it means to have participation that's kind of from top to bottom. So different frameworks that I've thought about have been like community-based participatory action or that type of research, but surely there are more frameworks that are more thoroughgoing and thinking about it much more from the perspective of framing the entire problem as a top to bottom thing, from where's the intervention of AI, how is data governed, how is it deployed, and how's the AI deployed, et cetera. So I'd love to hear what kind of different frameworks you are thinking and learning with.
Yeah, so framework wise, I mean, the work that I did, which Jeni referenced, was called participatory data stewardship. And since then, so much has happened that has kind of raised the questions that you're raising, which is it's no longer just about the data. It's about, you know, the technologies and the systems, and now you've got this sort of layer of synthetic data, and then you've got this other layer of the, you know, the LLM or the SLM that is trained on that. And now you've got so many different layers, potentially for multi-stakeholder engagement. But then the conversation that we were also having was about the problem formulation, I think the way you describe that, which is how do we even have the conversation about the right things to use these AI systems for? And surely that is the framing. So I've definitely taken it broader than the original report, which I think was a helpful starting point, but there's so much more now needs to be done, in my opinion. I say that as someone who actually wrote the report. I'm really like, I've learned a lot from some of the work I've been doing in other fields, and in particular in climate policymaking. One of the things that we did was we did some pilots of international citizen engagement work, actually in Kenya, in Colombia, and in the Seychelles. And there we took that, and we took a completely different approach, which was we started from the, and so what is the issue here? What are the questions that you as a community are trying to work through? And then we developed a 6-step approach, and I put it in an inclusive policymaking toolkit for climate action. But actually, I think this approach is also very relevant to AI, which has similar challenges, cross border, also increasingly complex and requires broad multi-stakeholder buy-in. So that's one framework I can point you towards, but I'm sure there are others.
That's a great question. For a lot of Indigenous research, which I think could be applied in the Western context, would be the 4 R's. You know, that would just boils down to relationality, reciprocity, relevance, and respect. Normally, my wife talks about this, so I'm usually like, I'm the computer nerd. So, but it basically comes down to, you know, respect. You know, do your communities have given you consent? Is what you're doing actually relevant to what they want? And is the research not just one-sided? Are you doing something that's given reciprocity going back, and also making sure that you're building kinship with these individuals? And if you apply that to large language models, and I'm going to channel Emily Bender here, there actually is not a strong use case for them. They are horribly expensive. They're computationally very, electricity requirements are quite high. And the cost per user per query doesn't make them financially sustainable. The data requirements do not make them financially feasible. And there's not really a strong use case because they're essentially replicating stochastically what we already have using conventional algorithms. And so it's basically a toy at this point. And it's probably a necessary step until the next phase of artificial intelligence. But I would argue that had any of these 4 R's be followed, we wouldn't have large language models. We'd have different types of narrow focused small LLMs. And maybe large language models are that stopgap between now and precise, specific, tactical AI that's going to be easier to run and computationally cheaper and more relevant to communities. It's not like what we talked about yesterday about the presentation. I think that's going to become the norm going forward in smaller and smaller, more concise, trying to make up gaps where conventional methodologies find it difficult, like specifically language recognition. You know, it's fuzzy, it's hard. You know, there's conventional methodologies, but it's difficult from a human perspective, and that's where large language models are interesting. But otherwise, they don't really have a strong use case right now.
Sorry, I think you want to say something, Jeni?
Yeah, if I could, so during the AI Safety Summit in the UK, then one of the things that we did as an organisation was put together a people's panel on AI. So we had a representative sample of just 11, because one of them dropped out with COVID, people who came, listened to a bunch of sessions that were run in the AI Fringe, talked to experts, deliberated amongst themselves, and gave us the kind of perspective from like the normal people in the UK on the kinds of conversations that were happening. One of their big like first things that they said was, why is all of this conversation just oriented around technology as if it's something that's kind of we have to then adapt to and live with, rather than addressing the kind of problems that we are having right now around cost of living crisis, around housing, around climate change, etc. Like this seems, the conversations seem to be completely the wrong way around, right? So I think that really backs up the, you know, Alex's question about like problem formulation. It's like, who is setting these agendas? Who is it that is shaping these conversations? What are they, and the development of technology, and what are they shaped towards? And there are frameworks for bringing this in. So you know, I point to participatory research methodologies, which again, you know, really involve the people that are being researched in shaping the questions for that research. I'd also point to Michael was talking earlier about co-determination of technology in the workplace in Germany, and the way in which that's like inserted very early on in the process. That consultation is inserted very, very early on in the process. A lot of the conversation in the UK, by comparison, is really focused. It's like the organization decides that it's going to introduce some technology, and then it has a bit of a consultation about it, rather than really focusing upstream. And there are lots of advantages we heard from Amanda yesterday around getting that co-determination happening really early on in the process, because the workers themselves know where their pain points are, know what is actually going to achieve those kinds of benefits. So I think that there are some of those frameworks in place that we can bring, and we need them. We need to be deploying them now.
Okay, so we have 3 minutes left, and I think there's one person, I'm sorry, you're gonna get the last question. I'm sorry to everyone else, but we have to end on time so that people can get their flights and everything. So please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the interesting panel and interesting comments. I'm Ryan Burns. I'm a AAAS fellow with the National AI Research Institutes, including Trails, and professor at University of Calgary in Canada. So another Canadian here. And I'm sorry if I missed it, but I didn't hear anybody mention the OCAP principles. And in particular, Michael, I thought that you might be interested in that. It's the Canadian framework for Indigenous people around OCAP stands for ownership, control, access, and possession. And it's a framework for basically saying any data collected about us should be owned and controlled by us. And so I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that as a panel, but more generally thinking about how if it's right for First Nations people and Indigenous people more generally, if that might not be right for everyone, and what that would mean for generative AI if data collected about us was owned by us, not in like a property possession kind of market-based solution, but more generally like owned and governed collectively and so on.
Oh, that's a great question. And yeah, I failed to mention that. And yeah, so Canada actually is some interesting work on this. My immediate response is that a lot of what we're talking about is that we have a concept of community data within Indigenous communities. And Western societies necessarily don't have that. Or if they have, it's, history. And what I would think I think the closest thing, analogous thing, would be maybe data unions, which maybe one of you can speak to those, which is kind of an interesting idea, which would be akin to what I think. Yes, I think communities as a group should be able to determine collectively what happens to their data, just as a broad human right. But in a Western non-Indigenous context, maybe you can talk about that.
Yes.
Or you.
Maybe I'll hand to Jeni while I grab some water. I'll be back in 1 minute.
Yeah, Jeni, you have 1 minute. So,
Okay, so yes, completely. I think that other communities have a lot to learn from the ways in which the kinds of thinking around Indigenous data rights and Indigenous data sovereignty. I will note that other communities do not have the same nationhood, like actual recognition that Indigenous communities have, and that presents a barrier and some complexities to the way in which we can map those kinds of principles across to those other communities. And that I'm always interested in like where those differences actually are between other kinds of communities and Indigenous communities, and what we can learn, and where we do have to do something a bit different.
Reema, you can have the last word.
I would, but I'm not quite sure where we got to. So I'm really happy to pass on that one.
Okay, well, listen, thank you very much to the panel and to everyone here. And once again, this is.
Thank you.